He looked at me the same way they always do, like I didn't belong, like I wasn't worth their time. But what he didn't know was that I was about to change his life forever. Would you judge a man by his appearance? This manager did, and it was the biggest mistake of his life. The luxury showroom shimmered under bright polished lights. Spotless marble floors stretched endlessly, reflecting the sleek high-end sports cars that stood like untouchable masterpieces. The air reeked of wealth, expensive cologne, fine leather, and the subtle hum of exclusivity. This was a place for the elite, the kind who signed checks without glancing at the numbers. And then he walked in. The glass doors swung open, and a man stepped inside, his presence disrupting the pristine atmosphere like a drop of ink in clear water. His boots were caked in dried mud, leaving faint traces with every step. A faded flannel shirt clung to his broad frame, its fabric damp with sweat from a day spent under the sun. His jeans, worn at the knees, had seen more years of hard work than most men in the room combined. The scent he carried was different, not the artificial luxury of the showroom, but something raw, something real, fresh earth, open fields, honest labor. The shift was immediate. A couple near a silver convertible whispered behind manicured hands. A salesman stole a glance, sneered, then turned away. And then there was Nathan Sterling, the showroom's manager. He had been chatting with a potential client, laughter smooth and effortless, but the moment he noticed the stranger, his demeanor shifted. His shoulders stiffened, his smile faded, his eyes, sharp and assessing, moved over the man with barely concealed distaste. Nathan stepped forward, cutting him off before he could take another step. "Sir," he said, his voice laced with forced politeness, "are you lost?" The man met his gaze without flinching. "Actually, I came to see the new Phantom series. Heard you had one in stock." Nathan's lips curled into a smirk, his amusement barely hidden. He took in the man's dirt-streaked boots, the calloused hands, the sunburnt skin. He didn't belong here. "We don't exactly do test drives for just anyone," Nathan said smoothly. "This isn't that kind of place." The man raised an eyebrow. "That's so." Nathan folded his arms, enjoying himself now. "Maybe you'd have better luck at a used lot across town. They've got some solid trucks, more your speed." Before the man could respond, the glass door whispered open again. A gust of cool air swept in, carrying something heavier than just the change in temperature. But Nathan didn't turn. His attention was still locked on the farmer, ensuring he didn't take another step into his showroom. "Big mistake." A voice, calm, controlled, but undeniably powerful, cut through the tension like a blade. Nathan, the blood drained from the manager's face as he turned. There, standing just inside the doorway, was Richard Caldwell, the owner of the entire dealership, the man who signed Nathan's paychecks. And beside him, the stranger, the mud-streaked farmer, was handing Richard a firm handshake, his expression unreadable. "You remember Malcolm, don't you?" Richard said, his tone laced with quiet authority. "Our biggest investor, the man who just bought half the company." Silence. Nathan's throat went dry. Malcolm turned back to him, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Now about that test drive." Nathan swallowed hard, knowing too late that he had just lost everything. Years of dealing with men like Carter had taught Ethan one thing: prejudice always came dressed in expensive suits and fake smiles. The showroom sparkled with wealth, its towering glass walls reflecting the gleam of million-dollar cars, each polished to perfection. The air reeked of exclusivity, the kind that whispered to outsiders that they didn't belong. And today, Ethan was the outsider. His boots, coated in dust from the ranch, left faint smudges on the spotless marble floor. His denim jacket, worn and faded, stood in stark contrast to the silken tailored perfection around him. Conversations hushed. A couple near the crimson convertible exchanged knowing glances. Salesmen stole quick looks before dismissing him entirely. And then there was Carter Sterling, the showroom's senior manager, a man whose watch alone cost more than some people's homes. He had been engaged in an easy, charming conversation with a potential client, But the moment he caught sight of Ethan, his smile thinned, his posture stiffened, like a predator scenting something unfamiliar. Within seconds, Carter was in front of him, cutting off his path like a well-dressed barricade. "Sir," Carter said, voice thick with artificial politeness, "I'm not sure this is the place you're looking for." Ethan met his gaze without flinching. "That's so." Carter's smirk didn't waver. "We cater to a selective clientele." He let the words hang, eyes flicking toward Ethan's dust-streaked boots, before returning to his face with thinly veiled amusement. "Perhaps you'd have better luck at one of the used dealerships across town." Ethan exhaled slowly, his patience stretching thin. "I came here to see the Onyx Edition Viper. Heard you had one in stock." Carter chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "That's a $2 million vehicle. We don't just let anyone." The showroom door whispered open behind them. A gust of cold air swept in, but Carter remained fixed on Ethan, determined to usher him out before he could take another step. "Then Carter," a voice called smoothly from behind, a voice that carried weight, authority. Carter stiffened, his jaw tightened. The man who had just entered moved with effortless command, his presence shifting the very atmosphere of the room. A dark tailored suit, a sleek platinum watch, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. It was simply known. Carter turned slowly, his forced confidence beginning to falter. The man strode past him without a glance, coming to a halt in front of Ethan. A small nod passed between them, unspoken but understood. "You're late," Ethan said, his voice unreadable. A smirk touched the man's lips. "Had some business to handle." He reached into his jacket, pulling out a key fob, the very one for the Onyx Viper, ready to take her for a spin. The silence that followed was deafening. Carter's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, realization sinking in like a stone in deep water. Ethan turned back to him, a slow knowing smile creeping onto his face. "I don't need a used truck," he said. "I already own half this dealership." Carter paled. And just like that, the balance of power shifted, leaving Carter standing in the wake of the biggest mistake of his career. The moment the showroom doors parted, a ripple of silence spread through the pristine glass-walled space. The scent of polished leather and expensive cologne hung heavy in the air, but it wasn't enough to mask the unmistakable tension that followed the man who stepped inside. His boots, still dusted with dried earth, scuffed against the flawless marble floor, leaving behind faint marks that had no place in a temple of luxury like this. His jacket, worn at the elbows, carried the crisp scent of the open fields, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the dealership. Across the room, Ethan caught the slow, measured shift in the manager's posture. Carter Sterling had been entertaining a client near the latest flagship model, his laughter rich with practiced charm. But the moment his gaze landed on Ethan, his expression cooled, the amusement drained from his eyes, replaced by something unreadable yet unmistakable: judgment. Carter adjusted his watch, stepping away from the sports car with an air of controlled authority. "Sir," he said, his tone carrying the kind of politeness that barely concealed its condescension, "are you lost?" Ethan exhaled slowly, his lips barely curving in amusement. Didn't realize luxury cars required a GPS to find. His voice was steady, unbothered. Carter's smirk remained, but his fingers curled subtly against the fabric of his tailored suit. "We cater to a particular clientele." He let the words linger, his eyes flicking just once to Ethan's boots before settling back onto his face. "Perhaps you'd find something more in your range at one of the lots across town." The weight of the room shifted. Conversations quieted. A few employees cast wary glances, as if already sensing the miscalculation unfolding. Ethan could feel the moment tightening, a rope slowly pulling taut. "I came here to see the Phantom GT, Ethan said finally, voice measured. "Heard you had one in stock." Carter's laugh was short, clipped. "That's a $3 million car." Ethan's brow lifted slightly. And, Carter continued, barely suppressing his amusement, "we don't exactly, how should I put this, offer test drives to just anyone. A hush settled. The kind that made people listen, the kind that made people remember. The showroom doors whispered open again, ushering in a gust of cold air, but Carter barely spared a glance. His focus remained fixed on Ethan, determined to send him back the way he came. Then Carter. The voice was smooth, calm, yet it sliced through the tension like a blade. Carter turned, and in an instant the color drained from his face. The man who had entered didn't need to demand attention. It followed him. His suit was precision cut, his watch catching the light in a way that spoke of wealth without effort. He walked with a confidence that wasn't taught but inherited, the kind that made people step aside before realizing why. The shift was immediate. Carter straightened, his smirk faltering. "Mr. Blackwood," but the man had already moved past him, his sharp gaze locked onto Ethan. And then, "You're late." Ethan exhaled, shaking his head. "Got caught up with some last-minute calls." The words were casual, but the room caught fire with realization. Carter's mouth opened slightly, as if grasping for an explanation that refused to come. His eyes darted between the two men, searching desperately for a misunderstanding, a mistake, anything to undo the last 60 seconds. But there was none. The man, Mr. Blackwood, rested a hand on Ethan's shoulder, entirely at ease, then turned to Carter with a slow, assessing glance. "Tell me something," Blackwood said, his tone dangerously smooth. "You saw a man walk in here wearing work clothes, and instead of treating him like a paying customer, you decided he didn't belong." Carter swallowed hard. His once polished confidence had cracked, splintering under the weight of the truth, pressing down on him. The silence stretched unbearably. Ethan remained quiet, watching, waiting. Blackwood let the moment simmer before shifting his attention back to Ethan. "Did he even let you see the car?" Ethan shook his head. "Didn't get that far." Blackwood sighed, as if truly disappointed, then turned back to Carter with something bordering on disdain. "That's unfortunate," he murmured, "because I was planning on buying 4 of them today, cash." A sharp inhale from one of the salesmen, a quiet murmur in the background. Carter swayed slightly, as if the floor beneath him had just disappeared. Blackwood adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, eyes never leaving Carter's. "But now," he smiled faintly, "I think I'll take my business elsewhere." Carter paled, and just like that, the balance of power shifted. Brad jolted like a man on the edge of a crumbling cliff, his arrogance dissolving into raw, desperate panic. His breath hitched, fingers twitching at his sides as if searching for something solid to grasp. He had controlled this showroom for years, commanded it with ease, dictated the rules, but now the ground beneath him was shifting. "Wait, Mr. Carter, please," Brad blurted, stepping forward too quickly, the smooth confidence he once wore now completely abandoned. "Let's talk about this." His voice, once thick with condescension, had turned pleading, brittle at the edges. Jared didn't even slow down. His stride was deliberate, final. The decision had been made, and Brad could see it slipping away. His chance, his standing, his pride. But Malcolm paused just before the exit, turning slightly, lifting an eyebrow with a quiet patience that made the moment stretch unbearably thin. "Talk about what, exactly?" The weight of that question hit Brad like a freight train. He hesitated, scrambling for an answer, anything, that could fix the damage. He forced a smile, wide and artificial, hands gesturing as though reaching for an invisible lifeline. "This was a misunderstanding," he insisted, voice suddenly syrupy, with manufactured warmth. "I had no idea you were a family." Jared's laugh was sharp, humorless. He stopped abruptly, pivoting on his heel to face Brad fully, arms crossed, his stare cutting through the empty excuse like a knife. "Family," he repeated, letting the words settle in the air. "So if he wasn't my father, you'd still be throwing him out." Silence, pure, suffocating silence. Brad's mouth opened, then shut just as quickly. The entire showroom had come to a standstill. Employees had stopped pretending to work, their hands frozen mid-action, while customers, sensing the shift in power, pretended to browse cars but lingered within earshot, their ears tuned to every word. Even the younger salesman, who had spent most of the encounter shrinking into the background, now stood motionless, his clipboard clutched like a shield. Jared took a step closer, his voice calm but lethal. "See, that's the problem," he said, his words deliberate, piercing. "You don't treat people with respect. You treat money with respect. And if you don't see money on someone, you act like they don't matter." Brad's face burned crimson. His fingers twitched, his composure cracking like fine glass under too much pressure. "That's not what I meant," he stammered. But the words rang hollow. Jared wasn't interested in excuses. "So tell me, Brad," he pressed, his tone turning sharper. "How long have you been doing this? How many people have you turned away? How many walked in here ready to buy? People who had the means but not the look, and you dismissed them." The words hit their mark. Brad visibly swallowed, the walls of his arrogance closing in on him, suffocating. He glanced around as if searching for an ally, a way out, but there was none. The younger salesman refused to meet his eye. The other employees had already distanced themselves, their expressions unreadable, their silence damning. Even the customers, once entertained spectators, now shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing they too had been witnesses to something ugly. Malcolm watched Brad carefully, reading the flicker of realization behind his eyes. He had seen men like this before, men who believed they were gatekeepers, standing at the doors of power, deciding who was worthy and who wasn't. It was a role they played well, until the illusion was shattered. Malcolm sighed, adjusting his cap. His voice when he spoke was calm but firm, steady as bedrock. "You know," he mused, "I've been in places like this before, walked into restaurants, hotels, dealerships, always the same story, different faces, same attitude." He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Men like you think money has a uniform, think it wears silk and patent leather, but real money, it doesn't dress to impress, it doesn't need to." Brad's breath shuddered, his world collapsing in real time. Jared tilted his head, considering him. "You judged a man by his boots, Brad," he said softly, "and now, you're the one begging to be heard." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jared turned to Malcolm. "Let's go, somewhere that actually deserves our money." Malcolm smirked. "Sounds like a plan." Together they walked out, leaving Brad standing there, small and powerless in the showroom he once ruled. The doors swung shut behind them, and just like that the gatekeeper found himself on the wrong side of the gate. Brad stood frozen, his body rigid, as the glass doors swung shut behind Malcolm and Jared. The sound of the door closing echoed through the showroom, final and absolute, like the lid of a coffin sealing shut. The air was thick, suffocating. Electric was something raw and unspoken. For a moment nobody moved. The entire dealership felt like it had been thrown into slow motion, time stretching unnaturally. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on the room like a storm cloud, oppressive and impossible to ignore. Brad's heart was pounding, his throat was tight, his entire body felt hot, as if he were standing under a scorching spotlight. He could feel the eyes, so many eyes on him, burning into his skin, dissecting, judging, waiting to see how he would react. The younger salesman, who had witnessed the entire exchange, let out a slow, deliberate breath. He shook his head slightly, lips parted like he wanted to say something, but couldn't quite believe what he had just seen. "Wow," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Brad's head snapped toward him, his blood running cold, his panic turned to anger, a sharp, defensive thing. "What did you just say?" His voice came out more brittle than he intended, like a man clinging desperately to control. The younger salesman didn't flinch. His expression remained neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet sort of disapproval, a knowing look that cut deeper than any words could. "I said wow," he repeated, voice even. Then after a beat he added, "But I could have also said, you really just screwed yourself over." Brad's jaw locked, His hands curled into fists at his sides, fingernails pressing into his palms. A wave of nausea twisted in his stomach. He turned sharply, scanning the showroom, searching for something, anything that could shift the narrative back in his favor. But the looks on people's faces told him everything he needed to know. A woman in an expensive beige coat, who had been admiring a sleek red convertible just moments before, leaned toward her husband. "Did that just happen?" she whispered, her voice hushed but not quiet enough to be missed. Her husband, arms crossed, still staring at the exit like he expected Malcolm and Jared to reappear at any moment, nodded once, his lips pressed into a tight line. "Yeah," he murmured. Then after a brief pause, he added, "And I don't think I want to buy from here anymore." Brad felt something inside him crack. He turned abruptly, his breath coming in shallow bursts, his carefully curated polished confidence, so meticulously built over years of perfecting the art of selling, was crumbling beneath him. And then the worst part, the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that was easy to ignore, the kind that naturally filled spaces between conversations. No, this was something else entirely. This silence was charged, heavy, a damning kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence that swallowed a man whole, the kind that made it clear he had lost not just a sale, but something far bigger. He needed to fix this, fast. His fingers fumbled into his pocket, shaking slightly as he pulled out his phone. His mind raced, scrambling for a strategy. He'd call Jared Carter's office, apologize, say it was all a misunderstanding, offer a discount, no, multiple discounts, maybe a full year of free servicing, anything to smooth this over. He unlocked the screen, his thumb hovering over the contacts list, and then the glass doors swung open again. For a split second, hope flickered in his chest. Maybe Jared had changed his mind. Maybe there was still a chance to salvage this disaster. Maybe, but then he saw who it was. Not Jared, not Malcolm. It was Mr. Langford, the regional manager. And from the look on his face, he had seen everything. Brad felt his stomach drop. His breath hitched in his throat. He forced a stiff smile, his instincts kicking in. Damage control. Quick, fix it before it's too late. "Sir, Langford held up a hand. "Save it." His voice was calm, but it cut like a blade. Brad's mouth snapped shut. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, it was suffocating. And in that moment, Brad knew the consequences had only just begun. "My office now." The words landed like a hammer. Brad's stomach dropped. His entire body went rigid as Langford turned on his heel and strode toward his office, not bothering to check if Brad was following. He knew he would. The dealership was silent, the air so thick it felt like it had weight. No one spoke, no one moved. Every customer, every employee, even the receptionist with her fingers frozen over the keyboard, every single person in the showroom was staring at Brad. Heat crawled up his neck. His chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, to take control of the situation, but his mouth was dry. Words failed him. He already knew. He wasn't walking out of that office with his job. He forced his legs to move, following Langford, each step heavier than the last. The moment he disappeared behind the glass walls of the manager's office, the hushed murmurs started, a low ripple through the showroom, and outside, the sun was bright. The world was still turning. The dealership's failure meant nothing to the wind, to the passing cars, to the city that stretched beyond. Malcolm and Jared stepped into the afternoon light, the weight of the encounter lifting from their shoulders like dust shaken from old boots. The tension that had filled the showroom was gone, now left behind like a bad memory. Jared pulled out his keys, unlocking the doors to his sleek black SUV. As he reached for the handle, he paused, glancing at his father. "You all right?" Malcolm exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders like he was shaking off the last of the anger. Then he smirked. "You know I've been disrespected before," he said, but watching that man's face when he realized who I was, that was something else. Jared let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. You handled that better than I would have. Malcolm tilted his head, amusement flickering in his gaze. Oh, I don't know. You did a fine job putting him in his place. He slid into the passenger seat, adjusting his cap. I'm guessing he won't be working there much longer. Jared started the engine, the low, smooth hum filling the comfortable silence between them. But then Jared frowned. That's not really the point though, he said, his voice quieter now. Firing one guy doesn't fix the problem. There are 100 more just like him. People who think they can size someone up based on their clothes, their accent, their skin. Malcolm nodded slowly, rubbing his palms together in thought. Yeah, he murmured. But people like that, they always show themselves. The world has a way of humbling a man who thinks he's above others. Jared pulled out of the parking lot, his grip firm on the wheel. His expression was unreadable, but Malcolm knew his son well enough to see the frustration simmering beneath the surface. Still, Jared hesitated before speaking again. I don't like seeing you treated that way. Malcolm glanced at him, a knowing look in his eyes. Son, he said, his voice steady, I've been treated that way long before you were even born. Jared exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the wheel. He hated that, hated how normal this was for his father, hated that the world had forced him to carry himself like a man always expecting a fight. They drove in silence for a moment, the city rolling past in a blur of steel and glass. Then Malcolm spoke again, his tone lighter this time. You know what the best part of today was? Jared arched an eyebrow. What? Malcolm smirked, watching him beg. Jared barked out a laugh, the tension breaking like a snapped thread. All right, I'll admit, that was satisfying. Malcolm chuckled too, shaking his head, but then his expression turned serious again. Listen, he said, you handled that the right way. You let him dig his own grave, then buried him with his own words. You didn't yell, didn't lose your temper. You let the truth speak for itself. Jared nodded, letting his father's words settle over him. Maybe the world hadn't changed as much as he wanted it to. Maybe it never would. But today they had won. And sometimes, that was enough. There was a long pause, the kind that stretched just enough to make the words that followed sink deep. After a beat, Malcolm exhaled, then added, that's how you really teach people a lesson. Not by shouting, not by arguing, by making them feel the weight of their own mistakes. Jared gripped the wheel a little tighter, mulling that over as they merged onto the highway. The city lights blurred past, but his mind was still replaying the look on Brad's face, the panic, the regret, the realization hitting all at once. The world had a funny way of balancing things out. So, Jared finally said, glancing over at his father, where to now? Malcolm smirked, stretching out his legs, his posture finally relaxed. Someplace where the salesmen actually know how to do their jobs. Jared let out a short laugh. You got it, old man. The engine purred as they picked up speed, the road stretching out ahead of them. Behind them the luxury dealership shrank in the rearview mirror, becoming just another building, just another business. But today, that place had lost more than a sale. It had lost something far more valuable, because respect, true respect, isn't something money can buy. And for men like Brad, the cost of learning that lesson would last far longer than a lost commission. Have you ever been judged by your appearance before people even knew who you were? Or watched someone get treated unfairly just because they didn't fit someone else's expectations? It happens more than we think, and the only way to change it is to call it out when we see it. Respect people, not for what they have, but for who they are. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Let's keep the conversation going, because at the end of the day, character will always matter more than status.